It's 2019, almost 2020, yet gender-based biases still exist in the Western world. Leaders need to take a stand in making gender-based biases workplaces a thing of the past. The ideology that a gender is inferior to another must be stuffed out in organizations if we are going to succeed in the future. Today, my guests, Andie and Al, discuss topics such as why the gender bias still exists, reasons why the gender gap closure has stalled, how leaders can be aware of their own biases, how leaders can best stuff out gender issues in organizations, amongst many more. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Move for Leadership Podcast, episode 93, Eliminating Gender Biased Workplaces with Andie Kramer and Al Harris. Welcome all to the Move for Leadership Podcast. It's your host and founder, Scott McCarthy, and thanks for listening in. You, the listener, you are the reason why I'm here. And why are you here? To become a better leader. We don't need any more bosses in this world, do we? And you're here because you want to be a better leader, just like I want to be a better leader. And that's the reason why I do this podcast, is so that I can help hone my leadership skills and help you at the same time. So thanks for coming out. Thanks for listening. It's great to have you here. And today we're talking about a super important issue. And if you don't think this issue exists in your organization, you know what? Maybe you should think again. If you don't think gender biases don't exist where you work, where you operate, you might want to have another look, because you know what? I bet they do. We're just not aware of it. We're just not aware of it, and we need to open our eyes to it. And it's a super important topic, and diversity and just evening that playing ground for everybody. So everybody has equal opportunity. There's no one that gets discriminated against. It's super important because why? That way we're going to get the best people in the right jobs in our organizations, pushing our organizations to go further, go faster, do better things, and support our people better. And isn't that what you're here for as a leader, right? You're here to support your people. So this is just another way how to do it. Hey folks, today we got actually a couple duo. It's the first time I've ever gotten a couple on a podcast interview at the same time. But Andie Kramer and Al Harris, they are passionate about talking about gender biases and these problems of revolving around organizations with these problems. Oddly enough, they're actually two lawyers, but they've gone down this route of trying to stuff out gender biases in organizations, making people aware of the issue. So I'm not going to waste too much more of your time here. Just to let you know that this is a great episode, and you definitely need to listen to it regardless of what you think your organization is actually doing, because maybe it's not actually doing what it says it is. All right, folks, that's it for me. I'm going to let you go so you can listen to the interview. Sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Andie Kramer and Al Harris discussing how we can eliminate gender biases in our workplaces. Andie and Al, welcome to the show. It's great to have you guys here.
We're very pleased to be with you.
And thanks for having us, Scott.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's neat. I don't often have duos on the show. Normally it's one-on-one. So I think tonight's going to be a little bit different for me, but I'm sure what the audience is going to get out of it is going to be, you know what, outstanding. So let's dive in.
Well, we had, just for your information, we had somebody the other day say, isn't Andie and Al one word? So maybe you really only have one person.
That is hilarious. Oh, my. All right. So in reading your bios and getting to know you through online and stuff like this, like you both have, you have legal backgrounds. So what's the story about getting into gender-related issues? There's got to be something there.
Well, there's something there. For me, it started when I got out of law school, I started at a tiny little firm where they couldn't have cared if you were purple polka dotted. If you did a good job, everybody wanted you on their projects. And then 13 years later, I joined a big firm where they don't know you. And when
real big firm,
1,100 lawyers.
Wow.
And when people don't know you, they fall into the stereotypes and the biases that they have about women, men, leaders, families, workplaces, on and on and on. And what I found was that I was facing discrimination and bias for the first time in my career. And that was a shock to me. But then I was on our management committee and our compensation committee. And what I found on the compensation committee was that women and men would describe their contributions and their experiences totally differently. So that the men would talk about how wonderful and fabulous they were and how much they deserved a raise, a promotion, whatever. And the women would talk about the teams they were on. And that prompted me to start writing about what women needed to do to level the playing field. And Al and I have collaborated for 30 plus years. And so it was only fitting that I would ask him to collaborate with me on these issues.
Interesting that you would come across that type of mentality, I would say, in a legal-based organization. Kind of boggles my mind. It's not quite what we see on TV most of the time, like when I watch Suits, right?
Yes, exactly. They're also much better looking than regular lawyers.
Well, as a matter of fact, we do a lot of work with law firms. And in fact, we were speaking before a multinational law firm yesterday. We did a workshop for them. And one of the things that we try to point out is that law, like so much of business, remains a traditionally male and still highly male-dominated profession. At the very top rungs of the legal profession, equity partners, only 19% of them are women, even though women constitute 50% of the entry-level associates. So there's a real gender gap in law as there is in most businesses.
And for somebody in the military, obviously, it's the same issue. You don't have as many women in leadership roles.
That's very true. Very true. So you guys are basically pulling at my first question I have here. You're in the U.S. Here I am in Canada. The bulk of my listeners are the Western world / developed and highly developing countries, I would say. How is this still an issue? It's 2019, for God's sakes, 2020 soon to be, yet we're still dealing with this gap.
Yes, indeed. Well, to make a depressing question even more depressing, we haven't seen any progress in the progress of women into the senior leadership ranks in professions or business or academia since the mid-1990s. So women's progress has really been stalled since then. It's not just that we're into almost 2020 and haven't made any progress. We haven't made any progress since 1993.
And that's based on research and studies. It's not our own personal observations.
So what are some of the key themes that have been coming out of this research and studies that you're aware of? Are there some reasons that leaders can hone in so that they can be aware of it in their organizations?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, no one, or at least very few people, other than possibly the American president, is explicitly biased. That is, goes out of his or her way to disparage women, to characterize them as less capable than men. Most business leaders, professional leaders, if you strapped a lie detector on them and asked them whether they were biased, they would say absolutely not, and they would pass. And they would be asked, are your organizations pure meritocracies? And they would say absolutely yes, and they would pass that test. The problem is that while they sincerely believe that with their conscious minds, bias works at an unconscious level. Bias works in our implicitly. It is a expectation,
assumption,
an assumption that we're really not even aware of. But it's an assumption that men are naturally leaders, women are naturally caregivers. Men are naturally decisive and independent. Women are naturally kind and nice and sweet, and they are your helpmates.
Right. So this goes to basically, our unconscious mind, the biases, even for those who are really great people out there, that's inherent in them. It's difficult to, one, notice, two, get away from. Therefore, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that regardless of how good you are, how much effort you try to make in ensuring that you are bias neutral, it's still going to come out in some way or form.
Right. You and your listeners might be familiar with that optical illusion that has two parallel lines, where one has arrows pointing in and the other has arrows pointing out. And the arrows pointing in look smaller than the one with the arrows pointing out.
Right.
The tail end of the arrow. And you could be told 1,000,000 times that the lines are exactly even, but your mind sees one longer than the other.
Right.
And that's really what unconscious implicit bias is all about. And so for moving leadership forward, which is obviously what all of your listeners are interested in, the very first thing to do is to be certain that they have information about bias, that they are introduced to the subject. So talking with us and us talking with you is sort of step one. But unfortunately, that's not enough. Just recognizing it is not going to make our mind see the two lines equal, because no matter how many times we're told that the two lines are equal, our eyes see them as unequal. And so that really requires people in leadership positions to make concerted efforts to prevent those biases from creeping into important decisions like hiring or career-enhancing projects or promotions or compensation. And so that's really the harder part. Is information is step one, understanding these issues, but that's not going to solve the problem. That's why nothing's changed since the 1990s.
So on that note, then you kind of touched at it. How can leaders be aware of their own biases, especially when we're talking about gender in the workplace?
Well,
what are your thoughts there?
I guess I have two different approaches.
Okay.
One, while information that Andie was talking about is powerful, it's far more important that leaders not be so much aware of their own biases as to become aware of how much harder it is for women to move up in leadership than it is for men. That is, if we can get the men to recognize that women are up against obstacles because of implicit bias, it doesn't have to be their own, because of institutional structure, because of family demands, whatever it is, if we can get them to recognize that it is just plain tougher for women to move up than it is for men, that's a far more important than to get them to recognize their own bias. The second is to get them, once they realize that, to implement policies and practices that will interrupt the flow of discriminatory or biased instinct. They don't have to think that they're bad people. They don't have to think that they are somehow at fault. But what they do have to recognize is that there are institutional pressures, institutional forces that are systematically discriminating against women, and they need to be attuned to those and then to put into practice processes that will not allow those instincts to interrupt women's career advancement. Excuse me.
Interesting. So I'm going to play a little devil's advocate now.
Sure.
In that a lot of one of the biggest arguments against, I would say, the reasons why we need more women in higher level leaderships and stuff. It's all good. Life happens, right?
Yes, right.
So I'll just quickly rephrase. So one of the arguments that you often hear against the number of women who are currently in leadership roles is that often, women leave the workplace. They start families. They exit the workplace for a substantial amount of time before they return after the kids are a certain age and stuff like that. What's your counter to that?
Well, as a starting point, the studies show that women start their careers just as ambitious as men, that they
100%.
have the same career objectives and goals and dreams. But by the time they've been in their careers 2, 3, 4 years, they've already been beaten down to the point where their ambition is waning. And it's not because they want to go home and have families. It's because the workplace is not welcoming to them.
Mm-hmm.
The other counter to that is that it's just plain false.
I love it.
LeanIn.org and McKinsey have been doing studies since 2015 on women in the workplace. And just recently, they came out with the Women in the Workplace 2019 study. And that study shows that only about 2% of men and 2% of women at any time are thinking about leaving the workplace. And they have a pretty bold conclusion that women do not leave the workplace voluntarily or for their children any more frequently than men do.
They just get pushed out.
Interesting. No, not that I believe that argument, but that is definitely the one you often hear. So,
no question about it. You question about it. And
I wanted to get your opinion on it for sure.
Yeah.
So let's just change gears a little bit. And I would like to get some of your opinions and best practices on how leaders can address gender issues within their organizations, whether that is obviously harassment wouldn't be tolerated, but still these obvious bias towards male dominant organizations. So leaders who are currently in those organizations, what are some best practices for them to address it within their organization and even out the playing field for everybody?
Okay. Well, you've given us an opportunity to plug our new book, which is It's Not You, It's the Workplace, Women's Conflict at Work and the Bias That Built It. Mm-hmm. And although a bulk of the book is talking about what women can do to have better workplace relationships with women, it's really because the workplaces are biased that puts women in those situations. And so the last chapter of our book has a 7-step program that we've developed about how to try to prevent implicit unconscious bias, gender bias from affecting careers. And the first step is the one that I mentioned about information. But I'll give you just one more example, and then I'll let Al pick a few that he likes, which is blind auditions. You may be familiar with the fact that in the 1960s, 1970s, the major symphony orchestras in the United States were almost exclusively white men. And the auditioning process for major symphonies changed so that women and men, white people, brown people, black people, purple polka dotted people would be doing their audition on their musical instrument behind a screen so that the judges would not see who was doing the playing, who was doing the performing. And in fact, the women who would have high heels on would take their heels off and walk across the stage without their shoes on so they wouldn't be tipping their foot actually, as to, whether it was a man or a woman. And most major symphony orchestras now are about 50-50.
So that principle of blind auditions can be applied by businesses in many ways. Gender can be stripped out of resumes when evaluations are being made on a purely written criteria. Gender can be stripped out. We can find ways in which we can decrease the subjectivity of the evaluation processes by forcing people to utilize criteria that are job specific as opposed to subjective, so that we can prevent them from saying, he's a go-getter, she's a little aggressive.
And you and your listeners might be familiar with the Rooney Rule from the NFL, where the Rooney Rule was implemented because the coaching and the front office was almost all white men. And what the Rooney Rule is that you have at least one, two, depends on, what the policy is of the organization. But in the NFL, you'd at least have some person of color, some person other than the traditional, normally selected person in the interview pool. It didn't mean that they would necessarily get the job. It's not an assurance that the job would be available to that person, but that they would at least get an interview. They would be in the mix. And the composition of the coaching staff and the front office changed dramatically in the NFL after that. And so organizations can adopt something like that, where they make sure that there's more diversity in the candidate pools, for example.
That's an interesting idea. So basically either force the idea or force, I wouldn't say idea, solution, I guess, for lack of a better term, through a policy such as the last example, or removing all the potential bias indicators from the various candidate files, right, so that the leadership or the panel, the board, isn't necessarily directly influenced immediately with the bias, with their biases.
Right. Now, one of the hard things about that, the hard sell about it, is that there's two biases at work in keeping women, holding women back in leadership roles. One of them is gender bias, which we've talked about, which is that somehow women are not as good as men in certain areas. That's what the bias is all about there. But there's also something that's called affinity bias. And affinity bias is the bias that we all have, which is we like to hang around with people that look like us.
Right.
And so for senior leaders who are very often, pretty homogeneous, they like to hang around with people like themselves. And so that's another factor that has to be considered. And that's another reason why removing some of the characteristics of the person or adopting a Rooney Rule type concept can be very valuable. It's not going to solve the problem completely, but it is a very big start.
Right. And so what I would say to that is that's actually probably a bigger error than just being gender biased, in that if you have all the same people around you as you, your blind spots go extremely wide open to the point that you can't see only the things that you like to see or want to see because everybody else is exactly like you. Exactly. So that's a huge problem, more so than whether or not your board composition has X number of women on it or not.
Absolutely. And it's a self-perpetuating problem because it's easier to work with people who are like you than it is to work with people who are different from you. We feel as though we're going to get into conflicts or difficulties, or that we've got to be more careful at what we say. And so we have this preference to associate with people who are like us, who think like we do. But the big problem with that is, while it may be harder to work with diverse people, we get better results. Mm-hmm. We see more broadly. We have a perspective on the world that is far outside our own box. The
blinders are off.
The blinders are off. So the more diverse we can make our teams, our leadership structures, the better we're going to all do.
There's an interesting study, Scott, which is a group of mock juries, basically, where they would take 6 white men and present a trial to them, and then they would deliberate on the result. And they would do the same trial, same videos to a group of 3 white men and 3 black men. And what the researchers found was that the juries that consisted of 6 homogeneous men, the 6 white men, would not consider the facts as carefully, would not deliberate as much, and when they came up with their conclusions were not as fact-based and as appropriate as the decisions that the 3 white men and the 3 black men had together, where they would take longer for deliberating, they would be more careful with respect to the facts, and their decisions, their judgments, their verdicts were more in keeping with what the quote correct answer would have been.
Yeah, I've heard a number of different trials like that, not necessarily trials, but studies and the like. And yeah, it's definitely interesting. You get into groupthink theory and issues with that, and basically how the same people will basically not really go outside their bubble or their box. They'll just stay within it. So there's definitely, I would say, proven methodology that diversity is strength. And regardless if that is sexual diversity or orientation diversity, background, ethnic origins, et cetera, there is always strength in diversity.
Absolutely.
I'd be interested in your take on whether that holds true in the military as well, whether it's more difficult to get that diverse perspective at leadership levels in the military.
Yeah, we could definitely probably have a whole podcast on that where you're interviewing me for sure. But I'll give the quick Cole's Notes version is that we are just a reflection of society. We're still struggling with the same type of problems that the business world is struggling with, and i.e. trying to get more senior leaders that are more diverse, whether that's ethnic origins or gender, etc. So yes, it's still basically predominant white male led force. However, we are actively recruiting females. We're actively recruiting visible minorities. And we're trying to make sure that everybody has the same opportunities regardless of your gender, race, etc. So,
well, I wasn't trying to interview you, Scott. I was just really trying to get a perspective on whether, in fact, anybody had solved this issue. And
oh yeah, for sure. No. I'm just saying that it's so deep, even on my side of the ship, that we could flip the podcast around and
you could. Although you could wave in our face the fact that we've said that things have not changed for women in corporate America in the business world since in the middle of 1990s. And the statistics do show that there are more women and people of color in leadership positions in the military now than there were then. So at least you're moving up while the rest of the business world has stayed stagnant.
Oh, that's great. So I kind of want to boomerang back. You mentioned your book, and you're talking about how it's best to resolve conflict within the workplace, mostly in a female context. But what I'd like to talk about is how leaders can best resolve gender conflict, i.e. when you have most likely, and it's a sad statistic is, most likely the leaders listening to this show are male,
mm-hmm.
but they may have a female and female conflict within their organization. So for that person, or it could be inverse, right? It could be a female leader with a male conflict going on in their organization. What are some of the best practices to resolve this? Do you guys go into that type of resolution?
Yes, we do. Let's just stick with the male boss, female conflict. The first step is to not think that if the women are having problems working with each other, it's a, quote, cat fight. That's the stereotype, that women are inherently competitive with and mean towards, hostile towards other women. Well, male leaders have to get rid of that notion. Women have conflicts with other women for the same reasons that men do, and their conflicts are no more disruptive to organizational harmony than men's are. So they've got to focus on what's causing the conflict. Now, the primary reason that the conflicts are occurring, if it isn't for the same reasons that men are, namely disagreement about how to complete a task or
get a project
done or design a ship, are because the women have fewer opportunities than the men do. There are fewer seats at the leadership table for the women. That women, once they move up, become very protective of their turf because they realize that they're isolated. If another woman moves up, they're going to have to move down. So there are all sorts of dynamics that men have to recognize, put women into conflicts with other women in unique ways, and they need to focus on what is causing this conflict. Is the conflict because these two women want the same job and there's only one woman's job, women's place? Is it because the senior woman feels threatened, or is it something else? So to resolve conflicts, you've got to understand why they come about.
That's why the title of our second book is It's Not You, It's the Workplace, because what we found is that women very often will say that they are, I'd rather work with a man because women are hard to deal with. And that's a stereotype. There are situations that women are hard to deal with, just like there's men who are hard to deal with. There's no, there's no gender lock on
being a jerk
or not. But the reality is that the workplaces make it harder for women, and that's really something that leaders need to understand, because that's where eliminating discretion and bias from career enhancing decisions, or even hiring somebody in the first place becomes very, very important. And the studies show as well that when you've got a critical mass of women in senior leadership positions, many of these problems just melt away.
Right. No, that all makes sense. And kind of I'm hearing you, it's like conflict is conflict, regardless if that, the genders involved. Essentially, as long as you understand the reason for the conflict, that's how you can go about addressing the conflict.
Instead of popping the popcorn and having everybody pull up a seat as if somehow there's some sporting event going on.
Right. Oh God, that never happens. Come on, let's be serious
never.
here.
Of course not. Never happens.
So we got another question before we wind down here. You hear often about organizations who are trying to make advancements with women in their senior leadership roles or key positions, et cetera, et cetera. And what they end up doing is bringing in policies that wouldn't necessarily favors women over men, but definitely puts them more forefront for getting these positions. In your opinion, do those policies, are they truly a solution? Do they actually help the issue, or are they actually putting a bigger wedge in the divide?
If in fact the policies are specifically designed to favor women over men, then they're counterproductive.
Destined to fail.
Because if the policies are clearly designed to favor women, then men will feel clearly disadvantaged, and they will get even. There will be a backlash. There'll be resentment. And the women that do get ahead will be seen as not qualified. So of all the ideas that we ought to resist, it's that notion. Our objective ought not to be to put in policies that favor women, but to put in policies that are perceived by everyone to assure absolute fairness in the assignment process, in the promotion process, in the evaluation process, that we feel as though merit is going to out. And that's key. It's not that women get ahead. That's a wrong emphasis. It is that merit gets ahead without obstacles in its way.
Right. The best person for the job at that time.
That's right, but we can't just say that. We have to have policies that make sure that that's the case.
There's an interesting new study. I sound like I'm the study girl today, but
it's fine.
An interesting new study which found that for those organizations where senior leaders say we're a meritocracy, where everything is fair and let the best person win, tend to be the most discriminatory.
That's interesting.
And that's because the belief that you're a meritocracy is a shield against
blinder.
It's a blinder so it's not believing that you're a meritocracy. It's having policies that assure that fairness will out, that you're going to do and make selections that get people who are the best into that job.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I'm aware of some of these policies in organizations. They do exist, and the females who I talk to despise them. They hate them because they want exactly what you say. They want that even playing field. They don't want a seat at the table just because of, they're looking for X number of percentage of women at the table. They want a seat because they've earned the right for that seat.
Right, but they want to be sure that they can get the same opportunities to earn that seat. And that's the problem. And that's really the problem that we have to confront, and that's the hard part.
So ultimately, the ultimate solution here is ensuring that, you know what, regardless of who you are, you have the ability to have the same opportunities as the next person next to you.
Right.
And gender and race and all this stuff shouldn't even apply.
Well,
provided it's fair to begin with.
Yeah.
Your mouth to God's ears.
Oh, Andie, Al, this has been an important conversation, really a difficult conversation, but one I think that is needed for leaders out there. Despite it being 2019, might as well almost say 2020 at this point, right? At this point, you guys being down in the States, me being in Canada, and like I said at the beginning of the show, most of the listeners being a part of the Western world or the developed/highly developing world, this is still a problem, and it boggles my mind. So before we wind up the show, wrap it up, I got a couple last questions before we part ways. And the first one is, according to you, Andie, and you, Al, what makes a great leader?
A great leader is somebody who doesn't believe that they've got all the answers. It's somebody who is open to learning and exploring options. That's my take on a great leader.
Well, mine is not so different. I think great leaders are people who listen and then are willing to take a risk with the decisions that they make.
No, definitely great words there. Lady and gentlemen, thank you again for coming on the show. This part of the show, I definitely would like for you to let people know, how can they follow you? How can they reach you? Learn more about what you have to offer. So feel free to give yourself a shameless plug, talk about your books, how they can follow you on social media, etc.
Well, the easiest thing to do is go to our website, which is andieandal.com. And the only complicated part is that I spell Andie, A-N-D-I-E. So it's ANDIEANDAL.com. And there they can sign up for our newsletter. They can check out our blogs. We have a huge stable of blogs. We've got information about both of our books, Breaking Through Bias, and It's Not You, It's the Workplace. We have information about our speaking and our workshops. And we also have an assessment about how would you handle a gender-biased situation, a potentially gender-biased situation. And we have 10 different scenarios there. And interestingly, what we find is that the men who take it have to put themselves in the shoes of a woman. And many of them have said that it's really been an epiphany for them to realize how much harder it is for a woman and that these situations do happen. And so I hope that some of you will go visit our website at andieandal.com. And we'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. For the audience, as always, it's super easy. Just go to movingforwardleadership.com/9393, and all the links are there in the show notes for you. Andie, Al, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. It's been an amazing discussion about a highly important topic. So again, thank you for taking your time, coming to talk to me, and most importantly, the audience about these gender biases and really how we can stuff them out and move forward together.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. We appreciate it.
All right, that's all I got for you fine folks today. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you enjoyed the interview. And most importantly, I hope you got something out of it. And if you did, remember, R squared, S squared, right? Rate and review the show so that it gets a little bit noticed, a bit more. But most importantly, I can help more people, because that's what I'm here for. That's what my guests are here for, is to help more people become better leaders and not being bosses, right? So remember that. R squared, rate and review. S, share the show. Share this show with someone who you think can relate to the podcast as a whole and today's topic. And then finally, subscribe. Subscribe so that you never miss another episode. And you can do that via your podcast playing app of choice through movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. And as always, stop bossing and start leading. Take care now.